The last video I made on this topic created a lot of conversation, which is great, but I wanted to take some more time to address some of the themes and arguments that emerged in those conversations. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this topic and trying to understand it from an opposing perspective. And the focal point for advocates seems to be the reduction of suffering. You may think that people in their final hours are needlessly suffering, and since death is inevitable, why withhold it from them? In some conversations I've had, it was described as cruel to force someone in that situation to suffer by withholding death from them. But that's a complete misrepresentation of what's happening. Notice the language that's being used here. Forcing someone or something is a description of what someone is doing. If we say that you are forcing someone to suffer, then we are implying that your actions are the cause of that suffering, when in fact, the suffering that occurs at death is a natural and inevitable part of that process. You might argue that if you see someone suffering, you have an obligation to relieve that suffering if you can, and I would agree with that. If I see someone starving, then I have an obligation to do something about that if I have the means to do it. But what if I don't? What if I can't relieve their hunger? Would it then be okay for me to kill them, since that would put an end to their suffering? Even if they ask me to kill them and I refuse, it's still fallacious to claim that I am forcing them to suffer or that I'm the cause of their suffering. And what about the moral misgivings of healthcare providers? If we normalize the practice of prematurely killing people, then this is something that they are going to have to get accustomed to. What about the psychological and moral stress that would be caused to them by injecting people with lethal amounts of poison as part of their workday? I doubt any one of us would appreciate the government stepping in one day and changing our job description to include suicidal collaboration. When we say it's our right to die when we please, we seem to be forgetting that this so-called right is contingent upon the actions of others, in this case doctors and nurses. If we say that it's our right, then any refusal on their part is actually a violation of our human rights. It used to be that our human rights were based on what people weren't allowed to do to us. But now, out of some perverse sense of entitlement, we seem to think that our human rights are based on what people must do for us. I don't believe in any human right that forces someone else to serve my wishes whether they want to or not. In my books, that's called tyranny. This fanatical fixation on the evils of suffering has us believing that death is preferable to suffering. Now, we in the developed world live such comfortable lives that we fail to realize how intrinsic suffering is to life itself. So when we argue that death is better than suffering, as a society, we're signaling to ourselves that an unnatural death is no longer the tragedy that we once treated it as, but simply one more way to treat the symptoms of life. When we say that death is a legitimate solution to subjectively defined intolerable suffering, then we are endorsing every suicide and every suicide attempt as a licit action, because nobody attempts suicide for any other reason. People who commit suicide do so because they've weighed the suffering that they're experiencing against the value of their lives and decided that the suffering is too much. So violently interrupting their vital signs is justified. Traditionally, as a society, we used to intervene and help vulnerable people overcome their suffering. But in a world where we institutionally and legally recognize death as preferable to suffering, we're not only endorsing, but possibly encouraging their suicidal tendencies. And what about other people who are vulnerable to the effects of the normalization of killing people who need medical intervention? As our population ages, elder abuse is becoming far too familiar. This is a phenomenon in which family members and care providers are treating vulnerable older citizens abusively simply because they can. It includes physical and verbal abuse, neglect, manipulation, and in many cases, financial abuse. There are far too many people who care more about their inheritance than the still living person that they stand to inherit from. If we think that these same victims of abuse will not be pressured into prematurely ending their lives, then we are recklessly deceiving ourselves. Advocates seem to respond to any and all of these concerns with the strict safeguards fallback. So as long as we have well-defined rules that govern our approach to killing people, then nobody will get hurt, right? I actually do sympathize with this argument, but in every jurisdiction where they've gone forward with it, the safeguards have been useless. For example, the safeguards in places like the Netherlands or Belgium say that a request for assisted suicide or euthanasia has to be well-informed, well-considered, voluntary, and persistent over time. In spite of that, in 2005 in the Netherlands, 1 in 5 deaths by euthanasia was involuntary and without consent, and nobody bothered to raise the alarms or impose penalties for those abuses. And in Belgium, euthanasia without consent was 3 times higher. The reason for that in my mind is fairly clear. Once you normalize the practice of killing people who are suffering, you'll become less tolerant of the people who continue to suffer around you. You'll be conditioned to think that their suffering is needless and without purpose. When we provide care for people who are suffering, we do so with the understanding that we are doing something that is noble and heroic. And I think that must be a consolation to healthcare workers who have to endure some pretty heartbreaking scenes in their daily lives. But if we get used to this idea that suffering is an evil that should be avoided, then what good is it to care for people who suffer when a quick and easy alternative presents itself? Understanding that moral regression might help us understand why the same jurisdictions that first opened up assisted suicide with very limited availability have since expanded it to virtually anyone who is fed up with their ailments. Now think about that for a second. When it was first introduced with safeguards, they went ahead and euthanized people in that category without their consent. Now that the category has broadened, what is to stop them from euthanizing people in that broader category without their consent? People like you and me who simply want healthcare for our ailments, but are instead pressured into ending our lives. I don't usually like to resort to cliches about slippery slopes, but when we see how those who have gone before us have completely lost their balance, why are we still walking towards that edge? Thanks for watching. We're making videos like this on topics that I find interesting, and hopefully you do too, on a weekly basis. So if you do, then please like and share and follow and subscribe and all that good stuff. And if you do, I promise not to take that for granted.